Hello there, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, we're going to take you to one of the potentially decisive states in this year's election, North Carolina, and talk to a top Republican strategist about what it takes to win the Tar Heel state.
We've got some great news. There's been a sudden drop in the number of Americans dying of drug overdoses, but there's a bit of a mystery about what's causing that decline.
Yes, that is a fascinating story. We're heading into the final stretch, 40-ish days to go till the election. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump turned their focus this week towards the state of the American economy. Trump giving a speech in Georgia where he threatened tariffs, not just on imports from foreign countries, but also from American companies who manufacture offshore. He pledged first a 100% tariff, then a 200% tariff, all while clearly still thinking that tariffs are paid by other countries to America rather than by American importers and consumers. And true to form, Trump then grew tired of all that economic stuff on the auto cue and he started riffing about all sorts of other things, including the recent attempts on his life.
So I've had a very interesting experience for the last couple of months. My profession is a very dangerous one. If you think of it, it's far more dangerous than auto races. 0.1% of the auto races die. 0.1% and a little more of the bull riders, that looks nasty, doesn't it? Die. Presidents, I don't want to tell you the percentage, but it happens to be a very dangerous profession. But you know, the only thing I can say is they only go after consequential presidents. It's true.
Well, is it though? It is true that some presidents who were the target of assassination were very consequential. Abraham Lincoln, JFK, Ronald Reagan all spring to mind. Gerald Ford, though, was targeted by 2 assassinations in the space of about 17 days in 1975. Hardly consequential. 4 of America's 45 individual presidents, by the way, have been shot and killed. That is almost 9% of them killed while being president. So, yeah, Trump's right. It is a pretty risky business.
Just before we move on, though, some of our more democratic-minded viewers ask us sometimes why someone would vote for Trump. And I actually think all that tariff stuff from before was a great example of good Trump. Now, I'm personally not a fan of tariffs. I think they are economically ruinous at times, especially on a country that you have a free trade agreement with, such as Mexico, which is what he was talking about. But I think that this is the kind of thing that Trump supporters love about the guy. Have a look at this.
I just noticed behind me John Deere tractors. I know a lot about John Deere. I love the company. But as you know, they've announced a few days ago that they're going to move a lot of their manufacturing business to Mexico. I'm just notifying John Deere right now. If you do that, we're putting a 200% tariff on everything that you want to sell into the United States. They think they're going to make product cheaper in Mexico and then sell it in for the same prices they did before, make a lot of money by getting rid of our labor and our jobs, and really a great name, because John Deere's a great name. I buy a lot of John Deere, tremendous. I'm one of their big customers. I buy a lot of John Deere product as a private person. But if they're going to do that, we're going to put a 200% tariff on everything that they want to send back into the United States. And you know what's going to happen? They're going to announce very shortly, if they think I'm going to win, or if I do win, they're going to announce that they're not going to build in Mexico.
Now, in reality, I can't see that ever happening. I think he's just talking out of his hat. But what voters see is Donald Trump throwing away the rule book and looking after them. And I think that plays well.
Yeah, I mean, the reality, of course, is that he says that it wouldn't be fair on American farmers for John Deere to be making their tractors and other things cheaper in Mexico. Now, the reality, of course, is that if John Deere were to be doing that, if you don't put tariffs on them, then chances are they're keeping their costs down because of lower labour costs, manufacturing costs, and American farmers get cheaper tractors as a result. Now, Kamala Harris also had her focus this week on the state of the American economy and what she would like to do. She's been criticised for weeks and weeks about not having detailed plans. She's now got a 52-page plan, which she's put in a glossy cover and put up on the website. She gave a major speech this week about it in Georgia. She also gave her first major one-on-one interview on the economy with MSNBC's Stephanie Rule. She was looking at Trump's tariffs. She's characterising that as a sales tax, which a lot of economists would say, yeah, that's pretty much what it is by another name, saying that it will disadvantage the average American family by literally thousands of dollars a year. Take a look.
To the point that top economists in our country, from Nobel laureates to people at Moody's and Goldman Sachs, have compared my plan with his and said my plan would grow the economy, his would shrink the economy. Some of them have actually assessed that his plan would increase inflation and invite a recession by the middle of next year.
For what's worth, the Goldman Sachs CEO saw that report very differently to how Kamala Harris saw it.
That report, which was mentioned last night in the debate, came from an independent analyst. And it's interesting, Scott. I think a lot more has been made of this than should be. What the report did is it looked at a handful of policy issues that have been put out by both sides, and it tried to model their impact on GDP growth. And the reason I say a bigger deal's been made of it is what it showed is the difference between the sets of policies that they put forward was about 0.2%.
Yeah, it's interesting on the economy at the moment. There are some signs that things are getting better, possibly a little bit too late in the political cycle to be of benefit to Kamala Harris and the Democrats. And they're both talking about how they can continue to stop price gouging, lower inflation. There doesn't seem to be a massive difference, though, between what Trump is talking about, except for the tariff stuff, and what Kamala Harris is talking about right now.
Well, there are some policies which are identical, like the no taxes on tips, for instance.
Right.
And they have congregated in the middle. But that's meant to happen in an election campaign, isn't it? Like we seem to be surprised by normal election things happening these days because crazy election things seem to be happening all the time.
Yeah, Harris did describe herself as a pragmatic capitalist this week, obviously pushing back at this idea that she's some wild-eyed and screaming Marxist who's going to control the economy. And in many ways, there are more kind of Marxist or at least big government interventions being suggested from Trump. Not that Harris herself is against tariffs as well. I mean, it does seem this is not the 1990s anymore. We're in a whole different era of populism and protectionism.
Well, that was one of Trump's strongest parts during the debate, saying if you don't like my tariffs, why have you kept them all?
Yeah. Well, this is certainly a big battleground right now. The economy is still a strong suit for Donald Trump, but not by as much as it had been. Trump is leading Harris by 6 points in the polls. This is over a number of different polls looking at who is best at handling the economy, whereas back when Joe Biden was the nominee, it was a 12-point lead for Donald Trump. So things have been getting better for Harris, but she's still behind on that measure. National opinion polls, though, remain fairly stable this week, with Harris leading by an average of 2.6 percentage points. Since Joe Biden dropped out in late July, Harris has consistently led Trump. The range of their vote share for the two candidates at the moment is interesting as well. Harris began in July at around 44% of the vote, has steadily climbed to have been above 48% through the month of September. She's now just 0.1% below her best average figure, so she's doing okay. Trump also ended July at around that 44% mark. Then he fell almost a point when Harris got into the race, but after Kennedy dropped out a month ago, Trump began to pick up support. And he has spent September above 45 points. And this week is his equal highest average at 45.8. And that's a significant figure because that is exactly Trump's share of the popular vote that won him the 2016 election over Hillary Clinton because of the advantage that Republicans have in the Electoral College. 4 years ago, with less support for third-party candidates than there'd been in 2016, Trump increased his share of the popular vote by 1 point. But, of course, Biden locked in over 51% of the popular vote and he won that election. But we do know in both cases, Chaz, that fewer than 100,000 votes in total across those decisive swing states decided the Electoral College and ultimately the presidency. So you'd have to say, as of right now, Trump is behind, but he is within striking distance. The Harris campaign cannot be at all confident at this point with an average national lead of just 2.6. This is very much a knife-edge election still.
Yeah, although it's interesting that on one hand, the Electoral College, I think, is looking better for Harris than it has been recently. Like, she's had some great results in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan are still looking strong, and that's really all she needs to win that election. But at the same time, while the Electoral College is looking pretty good, there are some other polls which are contradicting that, not head-to-head polls, but more fundamentals polls. Like Gallup put out a report this week, which I would have thought would be quite worrying for Kamala Harris, where they went through the indicators that in the past have been strong or moderate indicators for who's going to win the election, according to Gallup polling. and the Republicans are ahead in all of them.
Yeah, and this is fascinating because just last week, of course, we had Professor Alan Lichtman on the show with his 13 keys to the White House, where he looked at those and historical precedents back to the 1860s, and he said, based on those historical factors, which take in economic factors and political factors, that Harris was going to win, in his opinion, and he's got a 8 or 9 out of 10 record on that, depending on how you slice and dice it. Gallup, though, again, drawing on recent history and the fundamental issues that have determined each of those elections, have come up with a very different result.
Yeah, I'll just go through them quickly. The first one, the strongest one for them, was party identification and leaning. If you look at the graph here, Republicans are ahead 48 to 45. They have never been ahead since 1992. This is the first time they have been ahead. And when they go up, they tend to win the election. You can see the background, what colour when they win the election. And when they go down, they tend to not do so well in the election. But now they're not just going up, they're going way up and winning that category. Yeah. So that's the first one.
Yeah, and on that one, I did wonder whether there was an effect of the Democrats not effectively having a competitive primary this year, whereas the Republicans did, and that has driven Republican Party registration. That is certainly the case in some states where there has been a decline in the number of people registering as Democrats, but an increase for Republicans. But that's not yet being reflected in the polls. So it's going to be fascinating to see, is that a clue or not? It's
a good thought that it might be about primaries. I don't know. Next one, this is another strong indicator. The party that people see as best able to handle their most important problem, whatever that may be. The Republicans are ahead on that one, 46 to 41. The party that's won that indicator, and bear in mind they're ahead by 5, has won the election every single time since 1948.
Yes.
So, and they're ahead by 5 points in that. There was an NA in 2000 though, so you can take or leave that. But that's a strong indicator.
And that's one of those measures, a little bit like in the crosstabs of a lot of polls that don't just say who do you plan to vote for, but who shares my values. And it's often the candidate who voters identify as sharing their values that are ones that ultimately win. So that could be a key.
Yeah,
sure.
Then the next few are moderate indicators. Satisfaction with the way things are going in America is 22%. No one has won an election since 1980, which is when they started taking this measure, when they've had less than 33% in that measure, and there's 22% at the moment. The person who was 33% was Obama in 2012. So that's satisfaction with the way things are going in America, very low, 22%. Economic confidence is minus 28% at the moment. That's the lowest to have won an election since 1992, as far as economic confidence goes, was again Obama 2012. He was minus 1%.
Yeah.
And the Democrats are now at minus 28%. The party best able to keep America prosperous. Republicans ahead by 6 points, 50 to 44. No party has ever won this with a deficit since 1952, except for Bush in 2000. And obviously he only just won. So and they're down by 6 points, the Democrats in that one. Presidential job approval, we've talked about a lot. 39% is not very high, way lower than any party in history that's gone on to win the election. Party favourable ratings, this is the one where it's a wash. Republicans 43, Democrats 42, no advantage. But every other one, Republicans not just have an advantage, but a big advantage. If I didn't know anything else and I just saw that report, I'd think, well, the Republicans are pantsing the Democrats. They're going to win this election easily. But then you look at the head-to-head polls, the normal polls, and the Democrats seem to be ahead.
And that's where you have to say, well, these fundamentals don't take into account one very big important thing, and that is Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That if this was a generic Republican right now, a sane centrist Nikki Haley type, for instance, she could be doing extremely well in this election right now. There are exceptions though, and you look at 2000 where the US economy was going gangbusters. The economy was going so well at the end of the 1990s that the economy wasn't even really an issue, and so voters instead kind of focused on, well, Bill Clinton basically and his moral lapses, and there was a fatigue with the 8 years of Clinton, Lewinsky scandal, etc. And that worked against Al Gore when the fundamentals in that year should have supported the Democratic candidate. So, yeah, I mean, we'll know, I guess, sometime in the week or two after November the 5th, whether this is 2012, where Democrats grind out a tough, narrow win against those economic headwinds, or whether it's more like 2000, where they should have had some advantages and they lost them. And that's, I guess, always the problem with any kind of models or any kind of look at precedents. We're still back to 1948. We're dealing with a very small sample size. There's always going to be exceptions.
It's an interesting political science experiment regardless.
Yeah, it certainly is. As for some of the other polls, the week began with a series of very strong Sunbelt state polls for Donald Trump. They came out from New York Times and Siena, which typically has been a little bit more bullish on Trump throughout the course of this year, certainly. The week ended, though, with Morning Consult polls of all the battleground states that had Harris doing very well. So she went from being down by 5 points in the New York Times Siena poll on Monday in Arizona to being up by 3 points, according to Morning Consult. And we are getting, it seems to me, a really big disparity between, because the battleground state polls were usually, they're pretty accurate and they're a pretty good judge. They are swinging like way beyond margin of error. If the margin of error is 2 and a bit in most of these polls, these things are swinging 5 points this way, 5 points that way. A month ago, New York Times Siena had Harris 5 points up in Arizona. So 5 points up, 5 points down, 3 points ahead. Surely people aren't changing their mind that quickly.
I'm sure they're not. I think it's mainly the Sunbelt states doing the big swings. I feel like the blue wall, the Michigan, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, they're seeming relatively consistent to me, which once again is all the Democrats need to win. But I agree with you about the Sunbelt states are swinging all over the place. I wouldn't take anything out of that.
One of the interesting things to happen in Pennsylvania this week, Chaz, was they had a pretty high-profile visitor, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who was in the United States this week for the General Assembly of the United Nations. He met with Kamala Harris yesterday. And this is now one, we talk about there being not a big difference in some policies between Trump and Harris on the economic front. When it comes to foreign policy, specifically Ukraine, it couldn't be starker. Harris is saying that we will support you until Ukraine wins this war. Trump is saying, I will end this war, possibly even in that transition period after November before I even become president. We'll sit down with Putin and Zelensky and we'll end this war. When asked for details as to, what, are you going to give Russia absolutely everything they want or just most of what they want? He's not going into any details on that. But the fact is we've got these various forms of, whether it's foreign involvement in the American election or foreign interference, with Iranians have been hacking into the Trump campaign now being indicted overnight. Russia clearly see a Trump victory as a victory in Ukraine for them. So we know that Russia is also putting their thumb on the scale for Trump this year. And then we have the president of Ukraine going to a battleground state to thank the factory workers there for building the bombs that they're defending Ukraine with. I mean, they usually say that all politics is local. This election has got a very, very international element to it.
For what it's worth, I don't like foreign leaders interfering with American elections. I don't like it at all. I don't like when Netanyahu does it, and I don't like when Zelensky does it. I don't think it's good for anyone. I don't think it's good for America, and I don't think it's good for their own country, to be I mean, I know Ukraine is increasingly becoming a partisan battlefield, as well as a literal battlefield. But I just think that in the long run, it's not good for Ukraine to become a property of the Democratic Party. And to have just Republicans just write him off, which is what's going to happen if Zelensky just becomes a Democrat campaigner. So I don't like that. But, what I will say, though, is when you're talking about the hacking, I couldn't believe this what I saw this week. The Iranians, you know how they hacked the Trump campaign? Yeah. They sent a document to a journalist last week.
This is our mate Robert's
still at it. He sent a private lawyer's document to a journalist that was dated 15th of September. So they're still hacking the Trump campaign. Still, now. Even though it came out months ago that they were hacking them, they're still in there. And I don't know where this is going to go, but they're still getting new documents.
There is a bit of a mystery around this because one of the things that was allegedly hacked, it was a spear phishing email sent to a top Trump official. We don't know who that was. We do know that one of the things they gained access to was basically an opposition research document on J.D. Vance, who's being vetted to be vice president. Apparently none of what is in there is stuff that is not in the public domain, so there are no real skeletons in the closet there. There is a suspicion, though, because there's an intelligence assessment that says the Iranians might be plotting to kill Trump, and there's been suggestions that one of the two attempted assassinations may have had Iranian involvement. There's no evidence of that at this stage, but that part of hacking into the Trump campaign is to find out where Trump is going to be and then telling people about where Trump is going to be. We don't yet know why the second attempted assassination at Trump's West Palm Beach golf course, how that would-be assassin knew to be there in the shrubbery for 12 hours before Trump appeared. It's not impossible. The speculation is that there could be information that is being given, taken from the Trump campaign, given to radical individuals who might be prone to violence, and none of them are aware necessarily that it's the Iranians who are in the middle of this trying to orchestrate such a thing. So there's some fishy business going on.
There certainly is.
Now, let's head to the state of North Carolina. It is an important state, one that Trump won in both 2016 and 2020, but Democrats increasingly see it as winnable for them, giving them a potential buffer if they can't hang on to Sunbelt states like Georgia and Nevada and Arizona, but can win in the Rust Belt in the north. It's been a week now since the Republican candidate for governor, Mark Robinson, was embroiled in a scandal over racist and graphic posts on a pornographic website, including, of course, describing himself as a black Nazi. And that was done under his username and with his email address. But he denies it. He continues to deny it was him. The only poll that partially covered the period when that scandal broke had Robinson trailing Democrat Josh Stein in the gubernatorial race by 10 points. But that's about where he was a week earlier and 2 weeks earlier. So no real impact is discernible in the polls so far for him. But the real interest, of course, is whether Robinson's scandal is going to also be a drag on Donald Trump's chances of holding on to North Carolina. After Harris briefly took the lead in the average of Tar Heel polls back in mid-September, Trump is now ahead by about half a percentage point this week. What to make of all of that? Well, I spoke earlier to Paul Shumaker. He knows exactly what it takes to win in North Carolina. He's guided Republican victories for senators, including the incumbent Tom Tillis, in the past Richard Burr, countless other campaigns for Republicans since the 1980s. And I have to say, Chaz, Paul Shumaker is probably my favourite kind of guest. He's a political professional with deep knowledge and insight. He doesn't bother with partisan barracking, particularly on an Australian television show. He just gives you incredibly valuable insights into what is going on the ground and what he sees the likely result as being. Take a look. So, Paul, you're known as the data guy. What are the data points that you're looking at that you think might determine the outcome of this November's presidential election in North Carolina?
Quite frankly, the only data point that really matters if you're going to look at public opinion polling, media polling that may be available in the media format as well, is how are the unaffiliated voters going to break? In North Carolina, we have three groups of voters. We have Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliated. Unaffiliated make up the largest voting bloc of voters in North Carolina. If you look at the crosstabs in polling data, Republicans are voting for Donald Trump, Democrats are voting for Kamala Harris. There's very little crossover voting between the two parties. How unaffiliated break, that will determine the outcome of this election in North Carolina. If you go back and look at our voter registration rolls between November election 2020 up until right now, this point in time in September, this state has added 440,000 new unaffiliated voters, just over 40,000 new Republicans, and Democratic Party has lost 200,000, a net loss of 200,000. The voting electorate is totally shifted. Now, what that means is that, and that is reinforced within the data on the crosstabs of the partisan votes. Crossover Democrats have moved into the unaffiliated ranks. They left their party. Republicans had that happen in the last 4 to 8 years within their party. That's why there's less partisan divide. But the unaffiliated, the new unaffiliated growth are coming into this state. They're coming from the New England area. They're coming from the West Coast. They're coming here for economic reasons. They have 4-year college degrees or higher. They're high income earners. They have no loyalty to one party or the other or to any candidate. And quite frankly, they don't like politics.
And Paul, those unaffiliated voters, as important as they are, will they even be voters though, or are they perhaps likely in greater numbers to just stay at home?
That's a great question. In fact, that sort of gets to the crux of how is North Carolina going to turn out. Once early voting starts, we'll actually start to get a window into what the voting electorate is going to look like. Historically, unaffiliated voters have not voted at their level that they are part of the voting electorate. And both Democratic and Republican voters vote at higher levels of their registration levels. But right now, polling data is showing that there's a high level of intensity across the board with Republicans, Democrats, and also unaffiliated voters. Unaffiliated voters are four-year college educated voters. They got higher income levels. And also there's more spending taking place in this state. And so how they turn out to participate is going to be critical. And also what's going to be critical is how does the suburban urban vote turn out versus the rural vote. You have to remember North Carolina, basically we're two states. We're Northern Virginia and we're also Southern Alabama. If we have a heavy suburban urban turnout, that's going to benefit Kamala Harris. If we have a heavy rural turnout, that's going to benefit Donald Trump.
In the last few weeks, Paul, former President Trump has been criticised by many, including some of his own allies, for a lack of discipline in this campaign, spending way too much time talking about rally sizes and cats and dogs being eaten by Haitians in Springfield. Is there, however, some method to his perceived madness? And by talking about cats and dogs, he is actually making the issue of immigration and illegal immigration front and centre in this campaign.
Well, first thing is that Donald Trump not staying on message is not new to the 2020 presidential election. The same thing could have been said about Donald Trump in 2016. The same thing could have been said about Donald Trump in 2020. The reality is that he has a very high floor and a very low ceiling in this state. And what I mean by that is he basically has 47, 48% of the voting electorate baked in to his numbers. And he has consistently had that. The question is going to be, can Harris build a coalition that's going to be higher than that? The rhetoric, there is very few things that Donald Trump can come out and say that is going to shock a committed Trump voter. They're going to be there for him. We're talking about fighting for margins that are 10,000 votes or less.
Being there in North Carolina, Paul, interested to know what you think is the impact of this black Nazi scandal on not just the campaign of Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, but also the potential impact it could have on the top of the ticket for former President Donald Trump.
Well, before the news story broke last week in North Carolina, across the country, and actually, quite frankly, across the world, the governor's race was basically over with already. I mean, Josh Stein, the Democratic nominee, was outpacing Robinson 10, 12, 14 points, just about any polling data set. Also, Robinson was underperforming. The one, when I talked about no crossover voting on the presidential race, you actually saw crossover voting in the gubernatorial race. And that crossover voting was Republicans voting for Josh Stein, the Democrat. And that was in double-digit numbers there. So the Robinson campaign was already over. Does it become an issue for Donald Trump? I don't think so at the end of the day. The Democrats are going to try to make that part of an issue. But at the same time, Harris has got problems with the linkage to President Biden. Trump campaign's in a much better position to distance themselves from Robinson if they choose to do so, if they feel like they have to do so, versus Harris, who is not in a position to distance herself from Joe Biden.
Finally, Paul Shumaker, before I let you go, it would be journalistic malpractice for me not to seek a prediction from you based on everything that you're seeing and hearing in North Carolina. If you had to make a choice now, who do you think is going to be the winner come November?
When all the numbers that I've looked at, all the polling data, and continue to look at, I'll start to formulate a very hard opinion once I see actual voter turnout numbers. I know that mathematically, because I've already run the numbers, if I replicate the 2020 presidential race in North Carolina and take into account the demographic shifts and the voter registration shifts that's taken place in the last 4 years, it's still advantaged Trump. It's advantaged Trump by 30 to 40,000 votes, which is half the margin that he won by the last time. That's just if you replicate that same race. If we have drop off in the suburban urban areas with Republican performance, and we don't offset that drop off with increased turnout in the rural areas, which is going to be very hard to do given the lost voters in those rural areas, then all of a sudden it becomes a very dead even race. We've had close elections in the past, and I think this will come down to the wire. We may not know on election night how North Carolina turns out.
Paul Shumaker, many thanks indeed for having a fireside chat with me.
Sure. All right. Glad to do it. Thank y'all.
Now to a slowly building issue, what to do with so-called AI deepfakes. These lookalikes can look or sound exactly like a politician, although if we're being honest, John, right now they're still often quite dodgy.
Yeah.
But Elon Musk recently forwarded a video on Twitter that featured a fake Kamala Harris voice dubbed over a real Kamala Harris ad.
I, Kamala Harris, am your Democrat candidate for president because Joe Biden finally exposed his senility at the debate. Thanks, Joe. I was selected because I am the ultimate diversity hire. I'm both a woman and a person of color. So if you criticize anything I say, you're both sexist and racist. I may not know the first thing about running the country, but remember, That's a good thing if you're a deep state puppet.
Okay, so that was clearly a joke video. Conservatives had a great old laugh about that on Twitter. But then the California Governor Gavin Newsom just popped up and said manipulating a voice in an ad like this one should be illegal. I'll be signing a bill in a matter of weeks to make sure it is. And he wasn't kidding around. Last week, Gavin Newsom signed 3 bills. The first one bans people from posting or knowingly sharing deceptive election-related deepfakes either in the 120 days before an election or 60 days after the election. The second bill requires labels to be placed on deceptive AI, audio, video or pictures. And the third bill requires websites with more than 1 million Californian users to label or remove AI deepfakes within 72 hours of receiving a complaint. Now, it's fair to say the Conservatives on Twitter are very, very unhappy about these laws. They see them as a personal attack. But what about you, John? What do you think? Do you like the idea of these laws? And if not these laws, what do we do to address the concerns about AI deepfakes?
Yeah, it's fascinating that Newsom's been trying to bring in legislation in this area for about as long as AI deepfakes have been around. He was doing it back in 2019. And he's done a bunch of other things this week, including deepfake pornography and giving victims rights there if their image is taken from them. And clearly when it comes to election periods and election advertising, just as a matter of kind of standards to be maintained in an election, that no election ad should be deliberately misleading, purporting to be, whether it's Harris or Trump saying, I'm a terrible person and a terrible candidate, do not vote for me. That could confuse some people. I don't think that ad is going to confuse anyone. So I think maintaining standards in political advertising is a great idea. Obviously, it gets to a grey area, though, if you're taking an existing pro-Kamala Harris ad and then putting a negative Kamala Harris voice over the top of it, and, that could be something that would be classified by some as satire, rather than misleading political advertising. Yeah. I tell you, the thing that occurs to me in this, and this goes back to kind of my understanding of a lot of research around why people spread fake news, even before AI manipulation was such a thing. Just the kind of stuff we saw back in 2016. Incorrect news stories, negative stories about Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump that were just made up, but spread widely on social media. And a lot of the analysis then said people knew what they were doing. They knew this was wrong, this is fake, but they liked it because it was transgressive, it was naughty, it was fun. And it spoke to a truth that they perceived. So, they didn't believe that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring out of the basement of Comet Pizza, but to have something that looked like a news story that said that was fun to them and fun for their friends. So they would share it to them. So they were wittingly spreading fake news, knowing it was fake news, not necessarily wanting to do anything except express and confirm their pre-existing opinions and sharing that with people who presumably share or maybe even oppose their opinions just to give them a bit of a razz-up.
Yeah. I want to pick up on a few things that you said then. The first of which is, I think you made an excellent point that no one is going to get fooled by that ad. And that parody. And that is critical to the legislation. I don't think Gavin Newsom understands his own law because I don't think his own law covers that video. And what I'm referring to is there's 2 key words, materially deceptive, that appear in every one of those laws. Let me tell you what the definition is, according to that law. Materially deceptive content means audio or visual media that includes content that would falsely appear to a reasonable person to be an authentic record of the content depicted in the media. So you'd need to fool the reasonable person. The reasonable person is not going to be fooled by that video that we just saw, so I don't think it's covered by the ad. Yeah. And that's why I think things like satire and parody probably shouldn't be covered by this law at all. If they're clearly satirical or parody, then they don't come under law because they're not fooling anyone.
Yeah.
Right, so that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is, you also make a great point. This is not the beginning of deception. And it's not the beginning of faking people either. We have a Trump impersonator on our show almost every day.
Yeah.
Impersonators have been around for a very long time. Yeah. There's no reason you can't have a Kamala Harris impersonator do exactly the same thing as that ad. AI is not special. Yeah. Like, you can deceive people without AI. So why do we have special laws for AI when the problem is not the AI, it's the deception?
Yes.
And so what I would say to you is that this is a serious issue. it doesn't require new laws. We have laws. We have laws for libel. We have laws for fraud. If you make an ad that is fraudulent, that would convince someone else that Kamala Harris actually said this, and it causes obvious damage, then Kamala Harris can sue you for defamation and for fraud. That's how it works when it's not AI. That's how it can work for AI. And I just feel like we just need to use the laws we have.
Yeah.
And so now maybe they need to be tweaked slightly, but I don't think we need to worry about the First Amendment here. I think the tools exist.
Yeah.
We just need to apply them to AI.
Yeah, I don't think it's too cynical to suggest that when, and yep, obviously California is the fifth biggest economy in the world, a lot of tech there, so it makes sense that they're addressing this. But these kinds of laws are often very much in the category of just being seen to do something about this new thing, when you're right, existing laws are probably a much better way of approaching it. I also take a slightly different view on the dangers of AI. I mean, even as it gets better, and we're still looking at that sort of stuff and hearing that stuff and going, it's not exactly right, and any discerning consumer knows that that's just made up. My greater concern at this stage is actually not that people will believe fake stuff, but that people will not believe real stuff. Yeah. Think back to some of the audio tapes of Mitt Romney in 2012 talking about 47% of people won't vote for us. Hillary Clinton in 2016 talking about, about a third of Trump voters belong in a basket of deplorables. These things recorded on a sketchy mobile phone, propped in a corner of a fundraiser that wasn't ever meant to see the light of day. Well now, and we've already seen it, friend of the show, Roger Stone, is already saying, that tape of me threatening to have somebody murdered, that was a deep fake. Yeah. So people are now going to be able to, the better deep fakes get, the more people will be able to deny real stuff and say, that's a fake. I never said it. Mark Robinson now in North Carolina is saying, AI and the internet, somebody stole everything about me and my logins, and who knows, but we're going to get to the bottom of this. Yeah. And a certain number of people will believe it because, like old-style Russian misinformation, if you put enough false stuff out there, people stop believing the real stuff, and then you've got a real problem. I think that's spot on, John. I really do. Yeah, AI went back in time like the Terminator and put my name on a porn website. Yeah, but you're right. The people are using that excuse, and it's going to work. Someone's going to get away with something because of that. Good call. Now, let's, though, take a break from the election to focus on some good news for everybody. Drug overdose deaths have fallen for the first time in a long time. So if we count every year from April to April, that's when these stats were gathered, overdose deaths actually dropped 10% in the last 12-month bracket, which, given the spike over the last 5 years, was very welcome indeed. And the 10% increase in fatal overdoses, that's considered to be a large drop. There's been barely any public health interventions that achieved that kind of decrease, so researchers have described the drop as real. The only question is, why has this happened? It's not an easy answer. Now, some might assume it has to do with toughening up on the border, and maybe that's involved. But if the drug supply were actually being reduced, it would probably cause a rise in drug prices. That's the opposite of what's been happening lately. Other people might say it's because the Biden administration has made naloxone more readily available, and that blocks the symptoms of opioid overdose. But the implementation of those naloxone reforms started at different times in different places. In some places, the implementation's only just beginning now, so it's not really clear how that timing works either. And in fact, how often those products have even been used to reverse overdoses. So there are a lot of questions. Let's talk to an expert to answer them. Professor Joseph Palamar works for the Department of Population Health at New York University and specialises in drug use epidemiology. So, Professor, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thanks for having me.
So just how significant is the reduction in overdose deaths that we've been seeing recently? Is it possible there could be a statistical artifact?
Well, it appears that drug-related deaths in the U.S. are decreasing by about 10% within the past year or so, which is great. We want any decrease, but the numbers are still absolutely horrible. That's something we need to keep in mind. In 2022 alone, we had over 70,000 fentanyl-related deaths in the United States. So I take a more cynical point of view with the situation. I think we simply reached a ceiling when it comes to the number of deaths, but after we hit a certain number, eventually it starts going down, like regressing to the mean. So I think we need to keep that in mind. It's a positive thing, but the numbers are still horrible.
And Professor, are we still mostly talking fentanyl at this point?
Fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, that's the main chunk of deaths in the United States.
Are there any particular locations driving this reduction in overdoses, or are we talking a national trend?
We have the state level statistics available online, and it looks like a lot of states have had pretty significant decreases over the past half a year or so, but not all states. For example, I noticed that Oregon, which is known for pretty liberal drug policies, they have a predicted increase by over 20%. So it's not uniform throughout the United States.
And what should be our takeaway from that? Are you suggesting that the more liberal the policy, the more users you get, the more deaths you get?
I think it's complicated. So I don't think you have to go ahead and promote use. One thing I think that's a bit of a problem is we don't focus very much on prevention lately. I think we very much need harm reduction, and naloxone is a huge part of harm reduction that I think has helped decrease deaths. But we focus so much on harm reduction that I think we completely forget about prevention in the United States. And I understand we don't want to stigmatize people who use and so on, but it gets to the point where we're scared to say anything bad about use, and then people aren't as scared of initiating as they would have been, say, 10 years ago. So we need more prevention.
Now, this is a reduction in overdose deaths we're talking about here, but is there a corresponding reduction in overdoses generally speaking?
This only focuses on deaths. So death, as I think we all know, is the most extreme outcome that could happen. And we don't want deaths. We want to prevent deaths no matter what. But what about all the non-fatal overdoses? These are people who overdose and they're, for example, revived by naloxone. So, I mean, are these increasing? I think they are. We need more data on that. One thing we don't focus on enough is the non-fatal overdoses. I'm more interested in the people who have been saved or people who are at risk for dying, because those are the people that we could possibly help right now.
So this is being described as something of a mystery. How can researchers go about identifying what are the drivers of this decline rather than just things that people are doing that may be just coincidental?
It's very difficult to weed out what might be leading to these decreases. Again, it might be regression to the mean. It might just be that we've hit a ceiling and that it's not really possible to have that many more deaths. The only other direction it could go is down. That's a cynical way of viewing it. But we do need to figure out how much naloxone contributes to this. And another thing is, law enforcement seizures. And I published a paper recently, and one of my findings for 2023 was that 155 million fentanyl pills were seized by law enforcers in the United States last year. 155 million. And when you actually add up all the weight of the powder and the pills seized, that was over 35,000 kilograms seized. So a lot of fentanyl is being taken off the streets. So the thing is, we don't know how much this is contributing to the shift in deaths.
So if we don't know for sure what's causing this reduction, do we at least know for sure what caused the spike in the first place?
When you think about the history of the opioid crisis in the United States, it started from the prescription pills that were being pushed. And a lot of people became addicted to the prescription pills. Then they moved on to heroin. And then people who were using heroin were eventually exposed to fentanyl. And then people who used heroin initially feared fentanyl. But then a lot of the people eventually started preferring this drug because it's more potent. So that's how we got where we are today. But at least a lot of these people who choose to use fentanyl, at least we know that they're choosing it. So that's one situation. What I really fear is the people who are unintentionally exposed. So there are two categories, in my opinion. One category is you have like a college kid who uses cocaine in a bar or a line of coke, and there happens to be fentanyl in it. That person overdoses. That's a different situation than someone who is knowingly using fentanyl. Oh, and my other situation is we get these pediatric poisonings and deaths. You get a little kid, well, not a little kid, maybe a teenager who thinks he's buying like a pharmaceutical pill illegally. And then there winds up being fentanyl in it. And then the parents find the kid dead. So there's a lot of different avenues that this is going through. And my biggest concern is the unintentional exposures.
Is there something maybe about the way fentanyl has been used or delivered or sold recently that's changed?
One major factor is that more than half of fentanyl going around now is in pill form. That's a big change from just a few years ago. Just about 2 or 3 years ago, it's about 25% pills. Now, in our recent analysis, we estimate that it's about 50% or higher. So this has changed things a lot. Well, for the good and bad. For the quote unquote good, what we know is that a lot of people who use fentanyl like every day, a lot of these people are using pills, which they have a better idea of what's in them and how much fentanyl is contained in them, so they could titrate their doses. A lot of these people are smoking the pills, which is typically safer than injecting. So that's one factor. But the other problem with the pills is that you get these young people who think they're getting an oxycodone or an Adderall, and then it winds up having fentanyl in it, and then they overdose. So the pills could have, positive and negative associations.
Finally, Professor, you've talked a bit about the need to shift the focus to preventing people becoming drug users in the first place. What are the keys to that? Is it about information and education, or there are other things that can be done?
I'm not sure which exact prevention methods work. I always think about education. But one thing I have noticed is that people are trying very hard not to stigmatize anybody who uses a drug like fentanyl. And I understand we don't want to stigmatize anybody. But if we're not allowed to say anything bad about the drug, then I think we're really missing out on something. You don't have to have billboards with people smiling, all happy, talking about fentanyl and how they do whatever. It just, we could focus on the negatives and just try not to stigmatize that much. But we have to focus on some of the negatives because we don't want people initiating. That's what it comes down to. When I think of prevention, I think of initiation. What could we do to stop this person from starting fentanyl? Something needs to be done. Once they start, there's going to be a problem.
Professor Joseph Palamar, thanks for joining us for a Fireside Chat.
No problem.
We're just about out of time, Chaz. But by this time next week, we will have seen the one and only Vice President's debate. These things, they're different. There's not the same anticipation as there is for the presidential debate. They're kind of a weird sort of proxy battle. We'll have, Tim Walz criticising Donald Trump and J.D. Vance criticising Kamala Harris, and the two of them trying to defend their running mate. And so it is a sort of a kind of a one-step removed proxy battle kind of a vibe to it. Do you think it is going to matter much?
I don't think it's going to matter for the election, but I think it'll probably be good viewing because I think they're both, unlike the presidential debate when we were fearing what either candidate would come out with, I think both J.D. Vance and Tim Walz are both excellent performers. So I suspect it'll be a very high-quality debate.
There is one big thing at stake, though, for vice presidential running mates, and that is this person ready to be president at a minute's notice should something happen to the person at the top of the ticket? And given that Donald Trump is now the oldest person ever to seek election to the presidency of the United States, now that Biden is gone, J.D. Vance is one of the youngest vice presidential running mates. He's turned 40 now. Is that something that Tim Walz would be wise to try and attack, to say, is this guy, the crazy cat lady couch guy, fit to be president of the United States, or is that a sideshow?
Look, I mean, he might give it a go. I'm not sure it's going to be effective because I think no one doubts Vance's competence. They doubt his popularity. They doubt whether he's a bit strange, but no one thinks that he's out of his depth. I don't think. Like he's done 73 odd interviews. Most of them are on CNN. Most of them are on CNN and mainstream media organisations who are trying to take a piece out of him, and he holds his own. So I don't think he's like a Sarah Palin where people are concerned about him being able to handle it. So I wouldn't go that line, but they might try. I don't know.
Well, all will be revealed in a matter of days, as will this question of whether there's going to be another presidential debate or not. But that is it for this Fireside Chat. We'll be back at the same time next week. And we will see you for Planet America on Wednesday night on ABC TV.
Both shows are on ABC, iView, YouTube and Facebook, of course. And don't forget about the latest pet podcast available in all the very finest pod places. See you later.